And then I offer a tactical move here. Before I get to the specifics, I tell her if I were talking to your friend on these issues, I'd ask some questions. Of course, you know that's the Columbo tactic. I'd ask questions before I offered my own explanation because I think this person has some questions to answer too in light of this particular challenge. You can use them, these questions, to promote dialogue with your friend. That's what you wanted. You mentioned that in the letter. And the point would be to show that these kinds of challenges are often poorly thought out and that nothing meaningful can be concluded from the observations your friend has made. The questions serve that purpose while making them, the challengers, do the heavy lifting and not you. And of course, you know, if you've at all exposed to the Columbo tactic, you know this is part of the purpose of it. It's to realize that they got a lot of splaining to do themselves, right? And they can't just get away with making the challenges and it just everything goes away for them. They're on the high road. They don't have any work to do. You do all the heavy lifting. Nonsense. So I say, if I were you, I'd ask each of these questions one by one and listen for a substantive response before I'd go ahead with the direct answer to the challenges that you've offered. And this will force your friend, I said, to think about the challenges that he has offered. So, here are my questions regarding the issue of the death penalty for homosexuals. How does the death penalty for homosexuals in the Old Testament, and by the way, it was there in Leviticus, how does the fact that you find this in the Old Testament mean that we shouldn't take the Bible literally? I mean, the Jews and the theocracy thought it was pretty clear. That's why they executed homosexuals. They took it literally. Now, there may be a legitimate question of how this applies in our own time for Gentiles outside of the theocratic system of Judaism, which I'm going to address in just a moment. I mean, that may be a legitimate question. But I don't see how this has anything to do with whether or not the statements in the law, in Leviticus 18 and 20, were meant to be taken literally. I mean, this was part of Israel's legal code, wasn't it? Legal codes are not written in figurative language. They are always meant to be literal. That's the way laws work. And in fact, people who are careful about passing laws take as much ambiguity out of them as possible. So the first thing seems to me that this person's comments about literal are completely misplaced. Whether are laws to be meant to be taken literally? Of course they are. Now, it's a different question whether that law taken literally by Jews at that time is meant for us to be practiced at this time in the same way as it was then. That's a different question. But just because we don't practice that law today as they did then, it doesn't mean that that law wasn't literal. And my second question, if it's not to be taken literally, how do we take it? Figuratively? And what figurative meaning could such a text possibly have? Any man who lies with another man, as he lies with a woman, this is an abomination. They should both be put to death. This isn't poetry. There's no metaphors there. There's no similes. There's no figures of speech. So how do we take it if we don't take it literally? That's another question. Can you give me a paraphrase of those verses taken in a non-literal sense that would make any sense of the passage itself? 3, if we are not to take the Bible literally, as this person is arguing in light of these statements in Leviticus about homosexuality, then why does the challenger take Jesus' statements literally? We got to love sinners, right? Gee, I wonder what Jesus could mean. Obviously, we don't take that literally. It's a mystery then. We'll have to work on that. The injunction to love your enemies seems, on first blush, completely counterintuitive and ridiculous. Listen, if I were to take anything non-literally, it would be Jesus' idea to love your enemies. Why? I mean, when you're used to hearing that Jesus said that, but if just pretend you never heard it, and somebody comes up and he says, "Oh, love your enemies." You think, are you kidding? What could be more counterintuitive than that? So why not just simply dismiss that kind of thing, that odd notion, as not to be taken literally? That makes more sense to me. But he wants to dismiss the injunctions against homosexuality as not literal, but he's quite ready to take Jesus' admonition to love your enemy and love sinners and forgive people 70 times 7 and all those kinds of things quite literally. That seems to be odd. And I would like to hear his answer for that inconsistency. Now, regarding Jesus' own view of homosexuality, I have some further questions for that person. So there are 2 challenges that were offered to me. And before I even get to the answer of the challenge, I have a series of questions regarding the way the challenges, each of them was offered. Here's the second challenge. If Jesus never condemned homosexuality, let's just say we can't find a single verse in which Jesus condemned homosexuality. If Jesus never condemned homosexuality, so what? I mean, what would that prove? Is it right to conclude from Jesus' silence that he was pro-gay? I mean, if that's a right way of reasoning, then Jesus was pro-gay bashing too, because he never said anything about gay bashing. He was pro-child molesting. He was pro-wife beating. He was pro-slavery because he never enjoined any of those as being morally questionable. Now, I hope this goes to show that this is not a productive way of reasoning. And so anybody who offers an objection on this basis, the objection simply fails. Now, this doesn't mean that Jesus was against homosexuality. It doesn't mean that he's for homosexuality. It means that you cannot come to any conclusion based on his silence. You might ask your friend, if Jesus had condemned homosexuality, would that change your mind on this issue? I think not for most. And by the way, if not, then why raise the issue of Jesus' attitude at all? If it doesn't seem to ultimately matter, you want Jesus on your side when he's on your side, and then if he's not on your side, then you just disavow it. Like, well, that's just in the Bible. That's just written by men. Doesn't matter. As it turns out, Jesus did say a number of things that make it clear he was not pro-gay. First, Jesus thought he was God. It's a separate issue to demonstrate this, but this is very clear from the text. The same God, by the way, who gave the Old Testament scriptures. Now, it doesn't matter if any detractor believes Jesus was God or not. That doesn't matter to our point here. It only matters for our point that Jesus did. Now, if Jesus thought he was God, the same God as the Old Testament, then and as my niece's friend pointed out, the Old Testament condemns homosexuality, then guess what? Jesus condemned homosexuality. He was responsible for those laws. Second, Jesus said the entire law was valid, and he said it with force in Matthew chapter 5. This would include the passages in Leviticus that condemn homosexuality as an abomination. Therefore, Jesus agrees with the Old Testament condemnation of homosexuality. Third, in other words, I'm giving you 3 reasons to show that you can properly infer from the account of Jesus what he actually believed about homosexuality, even though he didn't speak of it explicitly. Third, Jesus made very specific comments on what God intended for marriage in Matthew chapter 19. That has a direct bearing on this issue. He said that God created only 2 sexes, and each was made for the other sexually, and that's why you find that one flesh phrase in there. This leaves no room in Jesus' own theology for affirming same-sex sexual relationships. It's just not there. So it's a mistake to assume that Jesus must be in favor of anything he doesn't explicitly condemn, first. Secondly, Jesus was an observant Jew who endorsed the entire law for the purpose for which it was intended, that is, governing Jews under the theocracy. There was also no hint that the same regulations, execution for homosexuals, should apply outside of that system, by the way, though it ought to give us a sense of what God himself thinks of this activity. And of course, this was reinforced when Jesus explicitly endorsed the normative sexual relationship that exists between men and women only as God's design for creation, or I should say as God's only design for creation. So, I mean, for the sake of discussion, we could be wrong in the homosexuality question, but those who disagree on that are not going to get any aid and comfort from Jesus of Nazareth. All right, 1-800